My father crossed the line when he mocked my husband's illness. I gave him a final warning, but he chose to humiliate us instead, so I threw him out of our apartment without looking back. Now our family is broken, and I'm left questioning if I did the right thing. I 28F. Never thought I'd be the one to cut my father out of my life, but here we are, and I'm still questioning every decision I made that night. My husband has been battling chronic fatigue syndrome for the past 3 years. It's an invisible illness that most people don't understand, and unfortunately, my father was one of those people. What started as occasional dismissive comments had escalated into something much worse, and I should have seen it coming. The first real incident happened 6 months ago during a family dinner. My husband had to leave early because he was experiencing a flare-up, and my father made some comment about how convenient it was that his illness always seemed to strike during social gatherings. I felt my blood pressure spike, but my husband squeezed my hand and we left without confrontation. That was my first mistake. Over the following weeks, my father's comments became more frequent and more pointed. He'd suggest that my husband was using his condition as an excuse to avoid work, family obligations, and responsibilities around the house. He'd make jokes about how some people just weren't built for the real world. Each comment felt like a knife twist, but I kept hoping he'd eventually understand or at least learn to keep his opinions to himself. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago. My husband had been having a particularly rough month, barely able to work his reduced hours, and spending most days in bed trying to manage the overwhelming fatigue and brain fog. I'd been juggling my full-time job with taking care of him and managing our household, and I was exhausted. My father called that Tuesday evening, and I made the mistake of being honest about how difficult things had been. Instead of offering support or understanding, he launched into a tirade about how I was enabling my husband's laziness and how real men didn't let their wives carry the burden alone. He suggested that maybe some tough love would cure my husband's mysterious ailment faster than any doctor could. I felt something snap inside me. I told him that his comments were cruel and ignorant, and that if he couldn't show basic respect for my husband's medical condition, then maybe he shouldn't be part of our lives. I thought I was being clear. I thought I was drawing a firm boundary. My father laughed and said I was being dramatic, that I'd come to my senses eventually when I realized he was right. He hung up before I could respond. I spent the next 2 weeks in relative peace, thinking maybe my warning had actually worked. My husband was having some better days, and we were planning a quiet weekend together when my father showed up at our apartment unannounced on Saturday afternoon. He walked in like nothing had happened, carrying takeout and acting as if our last conversation never occurred. My husband was resting in the bedroom, having pushed himself too hard during the week, and I was hoping to keep the visit short and civil. But my father had other plans. Within minutes, he was asking where my husband was, making comments about how he was probably napping again, and suggesting that maybe a real job with real deadlines would solve his energy problems. I felt my chest tighten as I tried to redirect the conversation, but he was just getting started. When my husband emerged from the bedroom, clearly struggling but trying to be polite, my father's behavior reached a new low. He started talking about how back in his day, men worked through pain and exhaustion, how his generation didn't have the luxury of taking sick days for being tired. He said that maybe what my husband needed was less coddling and more accountability. I watched my husband's face crumble. This man who already blamed himself for his limitations, who fought every day just to function, was being told by my own father that his suffering wasn't real, wasn't valid, wasn't enough of an excuse. That's when my father crossed the line completely. He turned to me and said that I was wasting my life taking care of someone who was perfectly capable of taking care of himself, that I deserved better than a man who couldn't even pretend to be strong for his wife. He said that my husband's condition was probably psychosomatic anyway, and that if I stopped enabling him, he'd miraculously recover. The room went silent. My husband looked like he'd been physically struck, and I felt a rage I'd never experienced before coursing through my veins. I told my father to leave. Immediately. He laughed and said I was proving his point about being too emotional and irrational. He said he wasn't going anywhere until I listened to reason. That's when I lost it completely. I told him that he had exactly 5 minutes to get out of our apartment before I called the police. I said that his ignorance about my husband's condition was bad enough, but his deliberate cruelty was unforgivable. I explained that chronic fatigue syndrome was a real, documented medical condition that had stolen years of my husband's life, and that his dismissive attitude was not only wrong but actively harmful. My father stood up and said I'd regret choosing a weak man over my own family. He said that when my marriage fell apart because I was tired of carrying dead weight, I shouldn't come crying to him. I opened the front door and told him to get out. When he didn't move, I pulled out my phone and started dialing. He finally left, but not before telling me that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. The silence after he left was deafening. My husband was shaking, and I realized that all my attempts to protect him from my father's toxicity had failed spectacularly. The damage was done. That night, my husband told me he'd been considering leaving me because he felt like such a burden. He said that maybe my father was right, that I deserved someone who could be a real partner. It took hours of conversation to convince him that his illness didn't make him less of a man or less worthy of love. The next morning, my phone started ringing. My mother, my siblings, my aunts and uncles. Everyone had heard my father's version of events. According to him, I'd thrown him out for no reason, choosing my husband over family, and refusing to listen to legitimate concerns about my marriage. Some family members were sympathetic when I explained what really happened, but others seemed to think I'd overreacted. A few suggested that maybe my father had a point about tough love, or that I should have handled the situation more diplomatically. The family split was immediate and devastating. My mother tried to play peacekeeper, suggesting that maybe we could all sit down and work things out, but I knew there was no coming back from what my father had said. Some wounds don't heal, and some words can't be taken back. Update 1. It's been 2 weeks since I threw my father out, and the aftermath has been more complicated than I expected. My husband has been seeing a therapist to deal with the emotional damage from that confrontation, and while he's making progress, I can see how deeply my father's words affected him. My mother called yesterday, crying and begging me to reconsider. She said my father was sorry and that family was more important than pride. When I asked if he'd actually apologized or shown any understanding of why his behavior was wrong, she admitted he hadn't. He was apparently waiting for me to apologize first. That conversation made it clear that nothing had really changed. My father still didn't understand or accept my husband's condition, and he was treating this whole situation like a power struggle rather than acknowledging the real harm he'd caused. My younger brother reached out privately to tell me he supported my decision. He said he'd witnessed my father's behavior toward my husband over the years and thought someone should have called him out long ago. It was validating to hear, but it also made me realize how much I'd been minimizing the problem. Update 2. A month has passed, and I'm starting to see the long-term consequences of my decision. My husband's condition has actually improved slightly since my father stopped being a regular source of stress in our lives. He's been able to work more consistently and has even started a new treatment plan with his doctor. But the family situation has gotten worse. My father has been telling anyone who will listen that I've been brainwashed by my husband, that I'm in an abusive relationship where I'm being isolated from my family. The irony isn't lost on me that he's accusing my chronically ill husband of being manipulative, while simultaneously trying to manipulate me into accepting his unacceptable behavior. Some extended family members have stopped speaking to me entirely. Others have tried to pressure me into reconciling, suggesting that I'm being stubborn and that family forgiveness should be unconditional. But I keep coming back to the same question: why should I forgive someone who isn't sorry and hasn't changed? My mother has started having health problems that she's attributing to the family stress, which has added another layer of guilt to an already complicated situation. Part of me wonders if I'm being selfish by maintaining this boundary when it's affecting other people I love. Update 3. It's been 3 months now, and I'm finally starting to feel confident that I made the right choice. My husband and I have grown stronger as a couple, and he's been able to focus on his health without the constant stress of my father's judgment and criticism. Last week, my cousin reached out to tell me that my father had made similar comments about her husband's depression, calling it a character flaw and suggesting that antidepressants were for weak people. Hearing that pattern of behavior confirmed what I'd suspected. This wasn't really about my husband specifically, but about my father's fundamental inability to understand or empathize with mental health and chronic illness. I've started going to therapy myself to work through the guilt and grief of losing my relationship with my father. My therapist helped me understand that protecting my husband and our marriage from toxic behavior wasn't just justified, it was necessary. She also helped me see that my father's refusal to acknowledge his wrongdoing or change his behavior meant that reconciliation would require me to accept ongoing harm to my husband. The family dynamics have settled into a new normal. Some relatives have come to understand my position, while others remain firmly on my father's side. My mother and I have found a way to maintain our relationship while respecting my boundaries about my father. Looking back, I realize that my father's behavior toward my husband was never going to improve on its own. The mocking, the dismissiveness, the cruel suggestions, they were escalating, not diminishing. If I hadn't drawn that final line, where would it have ended? My husband deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, especially in his own home. My father's inability to provide that basic courtesy, even after being explicitly warned, left me with no choice but to remove him from our lives. The hardest part isn't the loss of my father. It's the realization that the man I thought I knew, the man who raised me to stand up for what's right, was capable of such sustained cruelty towards someone I love. That's a grief I'm still processing. But when I see my husband laughing again, when I watch him tackle projects around the house on his good days without worrying about judgment, when I see him advocating for himself with doctors instead of minimizing his symptoms out of shame, I know I made the right choice. Some bridges are worth burning if they're being used to transport toxicity into your life. I chose my husband, I chose our future, and I chose to protect our peace. Even if it cost me my father, I don't regret it. The family may be broken, but my marriage is stronger than ever. And sometimes, that's the trade-off you have to make.